This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
So the proposition before this House is that the US alliance is our best defence, and we have a stellar panel for you here to debate this topic. So we're now going to move to the first stage. It's where our panellists make their opening statements. And our first speaker is Jeff Bleich, the US Ambassador to Australia. In that capacity, amongst the many things that he's been doing, he's led US efforts to advance defence cooperation with Australia, including the delivery of upgraded military assets to the Australian Defence Force. Prior to taking office, he was Special Counsel to President Obama in the White House. I now call upon Jeff Bleich to open the case for the affirmative before this House. Please welcome him.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for stating the proposition that the U.S. alliance is Australia's best defense. I'm sure that as Ambassador to the United States, it's a big surprise to everyone that I am in favor of the proposition that the U.S. alliance is Australia's best defense. You probably think it's some sort of job requirement. But the truth is that ambassadors have lots of excuses to avoid public appearances. So I wouldn't show up here if Intelligence Squared hadn't promised me that I would get the winning side of the debate. So the fact that I'm here proves that it's a true proposition. Thank you all for coming, and I'll look forward to seeing you for refreshments. Now, in fact, no ambassador would argue that an alliance is always the best defense for every threat. For example, if Australia's biggest threat today were rabbit infestation, then an alliance would not be its best defense. The core of the question is really this: what are the genuine threats that face Australia today, and what does Australia need in order to defend against them? Today, the greatest threats that are facing Australia are not rabbit infestation or an invasion or any kind of conventional conflict. The major threats to Australia in the 21st century are regional or global, and they relate to resource shortages, to cyber exploitation, and to criminal networks. Those things, resources, technology, and criminal networks, do not respect boundaries, and so no one nation alone can address them. Australia's defense, just like America's defense, requires partnering with other nations. The US, with the world's largest economy, most sophisticated forces, a 60-year alliance working closely together with Australia, shared values, shared friendship, is key to helping Australia meet these threats. And in fact, most Australians agree, and that's why 82% of Australians are in favor of our alliance. So let me describe what I think Australia's real threats are. The real threat concerns resources. They're the first one. By 2050, we're going to be adding 2.5 billion people to the middle class in Asia. Middle classes demand more food, water, and energy per person, and they require higher input foods. And that means that this region is going to have to produce more food, water, and energy than is currently capable of producing. If we don't collaborate on these issues, we're going to face some tragic consequences. Widespread droughts and famines, riots, mass migrations, conflicts over resources, and other humanitarian disasters. Now, climate change is only going to compound these effects by making droughts longer and floods heavier. Now, Australia can't prevent these resource shortages by itself. It needs capable partners with whom it can do the following things. We need anti-corruption measures, because part of the reason that food doesn't make it from the paddock to the plate in many countries is because of corruption. Funds are siphoned off, roads aren't completed, resources are squandered. And few countries are better at confronting corruption together than the US and Australia. We need more sustainable technologies, like renewable energy, water reuse, and naturally fortified foods. And no two nations are better than the US and Australia at harnessing these technologies together. We need rule of law to share technology safely, reduce barriers to trade for these necessary goods, and to keep navigation lines open. And our two nations are global leaders in establishing and upholding international norms. And Australia needs forces that are capable of responding to crises, to deliver humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And again, no nation in the world does that better than Australia and the US. So while every nation in the region has a role to play in Australia's defense against these threats, the US offers the very best part of that defense. Now, the second set of threats that I mentioned come from two new frontiers, space and cyberspace. Every part of our society depends on the security of cyberspace. Our financial systems, our media, our communications, our water supplies, our electrical grids, our command and control, everything, absolutely everything, depends upon cyberspace being secure. So establishing rules to protect networks and rules for cyber safety is absolutely critical to our future. Unfortunately, we need to work very quickly because near space is already crowded with satellites and cyber exploitation is already rampant. There are still very few rules to protect near space satellites and cyber networks from attack or exploitation. And in the meantime, states and non-state actors are compromising, stealing, destroying, and changing information. This is why we've made cyber part of the US-Australia Alliance Treaty. And of all of Australia's partners in the world, no nation is better able or more committed to defending cyberspace than the US. Finally, people love to concoct scenarios, pitting one nation against another in the region. But the truth is that Australia doesn't fear being invaded by another state. Australia's greatest risk from attack comes from non-state actors. And specifically, I'm talking about criminal networks. Networks that are increasingly sophisticated and engaged in everything from terrorism to arms smuggling, drug trafficking, people smuggling, theft of intellectual property, piracy, hacking, and other criminal enterprises. Now, their purposes vary. I mean, some are trying to take down governments, some are trying to destroy cultures, some are just after money and power. But these shadow entities operate without uniforms, without borders, and they target civilians. And this presents unprecedented challenges. The only defense against them is to have friends who share information and pool resources so that we can disrupt and dismantle these networks. And no two nations in the world do this better together than we do. In short, Australia's best defense, the best path to a secure future is simple, to work with its most capable partner to stop these threats. Now let me tell you what we shouldn't be preparing for. First, we shouldn't be preparing for a Cold War or another situation in which nations are pitted against Australia or the US in some zero-sum competition. The great and rising nations of the world are all interdependent today. Now, a lot of people I know sell books or get airtime by suggesting that the US wants to contain China or that China wants to fence out the United States. But anyone can see that this would harm both of our economies. Neither of our governments want it, and neither of our people want it. So China and the US are in fact betting on each other. Nations like Australia will not have to choose between the two of us. And Australia, frankly, is doing the right thing. It's betting on both of us, working with both of us, and focusing instead on the real threats that are out there. Second, we don't have to worry that Australia's engagement with the US makes it a target. Terror networks aren't focused on a nation's flag. They're focused on a nation's form. They're hostile to open societies with democratic structures. So Australia would be a target regardless of its alliances. Where we fight together, it's because we're threatened together. Our alliance is an equal partnership, and anyone who thinks otherwise clearly has never tried to convince an Australian to do something that they don't want to do. I'll just say, we agree on a lot of issues, but trust me, your leaders have no problem saying no to us. The kind of trust and honesty that we have has been earned. 70 years ago, the US and Australia, we made a pact as two Pacific powers to restore peace and prosperity to this region. We helped rebuild Japan. We brought security to the seas. We opened up trade. We brought nations like China into the World Trade Organization, and we championed human and civil rights. And those efforts have been a pillar of Australia's security. History has yet to offer a better foundation for building a safe prosperous, and free Indo-Pacific than this partnership. And in the 21st century, our fortunes depend more than ever on our partners. No partner is more important to Australia than the US because of our shared history and values, our deep economic interdependence, our extensive security cooperation, and most of all our mateship. Our commitment to each other is bone deep, and that is the reason why the US alliance is Australia's best defense. Thank you.
Professor Zhu Feng is Deputy Director of the Centre for International and Strategic Studies at Peking University in Beijing. He writes extensively on regional security in East Asia, the North Korean nuclear issue, US national security strategy, and military and security dimension of the China-US relations. And he's also the author of the book, China's Ascent, Power, Security, and the Future of International Politics. Please welcome Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Simon. Very respectful, Mr. Ambassador and Mr. General and the other panelists. It's a great opportunity for me to join you for this excellent debate. If I can do well, so I hope I can be back next time. I think there's quite a few cities, just like Sydney, will be more multicultural and I think, racial. So a lot of Chinese coming. Then everywhere I just walking the street at Sydney, I can see some sort of Chinese faces. But I think it's a very big, I think, the indicator of how close we are, despite of some sort of, we're still very different, or we couldn't have some sort of shared value. So then I think the world really changed. So with China's rise, I think my country offered a very reciprocal opportunities for Aussies, because now we are the leading trading partners. So when the United States keeps selling you the weapon, Aussie keeps selling us the mining goods. So then our relations has never been better, and probably also will be growing stronger. My view is this. I really respect the US-centered airline system. I think it's laid out very solid base for regional security order. It is liberal, it's open, and it's also, we say, very peaceful. So China feel comfortable. I have to tell you, when we just getting developed our economy and also marching into the international community and integrating us into the rest of the world. But world is also very complicated. For Chinese, we respect the airlines as a very important component of the defense, but we don't agree it's a base defense. So how best the airlines will be, it remains very questioned. First of all, if the airline system always just there and just well expanding, then we will see that will be some sort of unavoidable with a process of a militarization in Asia-Pacific. For example, since 2 years ago, when President Obama announced pivoting Asia, then we see the Darwin Harbor also become the new Marine Corps base. So then, of course, it's just for rotation of Marine Corps, but the problem is it's a very clear evidence the military alliance will inevitably lead to the militarization. Then another case is, for example, when the Vietnam War just hit the region, then U.S. opened the Subic military base at the Philippines, then Americans' military intervention to Vietnam also just flare up. But today, South China Sea is a stormy water. So then for many regional security observers, really wondering whether or not U.S. will open new military base in Philippines. If that situation coming up, of course, it's very naturally because it's a continuity of a shared alliance commitment. But if the new military base open, then we have to say some sort of a new risk of Vietnam War-like military conflict probably will crowd the region. So then how likely such a opening a new military base will just the following up for Americans' regional security supremacy? Of course, that question always being on doubt in the eyes of Chinese. I think the second reason I really disagree, the best defense is alliance is this. The alliance politics always will deepen the security dilemma. For example, how many military bases U.S. usually just anchor and just maintained around China? I can tell you 9. It's a non-military base. Yesterday, I flew from Beijing over to Sydney. The trip was pleasant and comfortable, but I flew over a bunch of military alliance and military bases. Yes, we say now it's Pacific time, but look at some sort of the job by both militaries, Americans military and Chinese military. They're really hedging against each other because when the U.S. maintains such a big size of military bases, then Chinese feel a little bit scared. Yes, we believe U.S. is a benign superpower. But if U.S. is getting less benign and also they like to force the will to China, how can we do? So then we also have to self-help. We also have to develop our military. So actually, alliance politics, yes, on one hand, it's some sort of anchor to liberal world order, but on the other hand, if it's not deliberately and very, very sophisticatedly managed, then it also proved to be some sort of a new spoiler to escalation of the tension. So then, security dilemma, why it's always just rolling out? Just because alliance politics always will move in the way just getting military bases, military commitment reinforced as much as can. I remember first term of Kevin Ross's administration. Then Canberra put forward a new defense white paper outlining some sort of looming China threat and a very sensationally revision some sort of a Chinese submarine while suddenly floating at the Melbourne. I don't think such a thing is real because when China and Australia's economic and social relations growing so robust and so steady, why we should dispatch the submarine over to the Melbourne, show how muscular we are, or telling you how mad and stupid we are. So then security usually is a psyche, is a cognition. So a lot of messy effects of a security dilemma just came from such a stir of a psychology. If you overstate some sort of a threat, then the consequence will be very negative. So then security dilemma will be also getting worse and worse and misleading the power relations. Last one. I think in my opposition to the alliance as a base defense is, I think the ways the alliance expanding, it also will inevitably stoking China's nationalism because we also need to feel secure. We also need to get to China more welcome the world rather than just easily and very even just unwillingly duped as China's threat. What makes the difference between China and Australia? Usually a lot of people say China is a communist state, but I can assure you China is not the communist state any longer. China just an authoritarian state. But such an authoritarian nature of the China system is the consequence of Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, and Chinese some sort of, we say, calendar situation. So then the biggest difference between the Chinese and the Aussie is you are very well developed rule of law society, but we are in transition. So how to get through the transformation? Most important thing is make the Chinese feel the world is really, really friendly. But a lot of alliance, it's reinforced the military commitment, usually will make the Chinese feel more nationalistic because no one can tolerate. So for example, just laying around your peripheral areas, there's a bunch of military bases. So last point, I really hope this world could be well connected and well cooperated. Then the alliance is a solid component, but never is a based one for defense. Thanks.
Catherine Ziesing is editor of the Australian Defence magazine. She's part of a new generation of strategic thinkers. She's got a keen interest in Australian defence policy, but in a global context. She has a Masters of Strategy and Policy from the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Please welcome her.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to make a few points in response to the Professor's comments. Darwin is not a Marine Corps base. For 6 months of the year, there will be a contingent of Marines training through the area. Australia is home to some wonderful training ranges that the US simply just does not have access to generally in terms of instrumentation. And I'm very, very glad to hear that China feels comfortable with the security framework that the US provides. And I know that there are a ring of bases around China, and there's a lot of US troops that need something to do. Many US troops that need something to do. So basing them around the world to perhaps welcome China and make them feel more friendly and more comfortable in the region is something that they could do whilst in the region. Now, for the last 60 years, a major part of the Australian defence landscape has been the ANZUS Treaty and the alliance relationship that we share with the United States. Since Australia became a Western nation a little over 200 years ago, we have traditionally aligned ourselves with the strongest maritime power in the region. For most of our existence, this was the British Empire. Post-World War II, it became the US. Our geography means that we will never be able to leave maritime security to chance. International maritime waters are home to a massive amount of trade that underpin the Australian way of life and our buoyant economy. Sometimes known as the global commons, these international shipping routes see huge amounts of people and goods transverse the globe. As Lieutenant General Paul Selva of the US Air Force and Vice Commander of the US Air Force in the Pacific said only last year, over 2 billion passengers a year and 35% of world trade by value transition via these international sea routes. On average, $4 trillion changes hands a day. Our way of life is based around our ability to trade, and anything that threatens that trade is a risk. A peaceful maritime environment is a precondition for continued Australian prosperity. The scale of maritime security in Australia is more than just boat people, despite what our politicians and our recent news broadcasts might tell you. How would Australia manage their natural resources if they were not secured? I'm not talking about your neighbour Bob down the road who goes fishing and brings home the occasional undersized fish for dinner, but trawlers that could come and take millions of tonnes of fish. In terms of ship movements, the seas of the Asia-Pacific are among the busiest in the world. Of the 7 major sea lines of communications, or the aptly named SLOCs, 4 of them are in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, a significant volume of commercial and military traffic is involved in Sea of Japan. According to a study by the Washington-based Stimson Center, there are more incidents in the Sea of Japan than there are any other theatre worldwide. About 15% of the total volume of world trade transits through Southeast Asian SLOCs. I could bore you with stat after stat that demonstrate the scale and importance of SLOCs, but frankly, I would like to get to dinner after this debate with my mind in one piece. The Asia-Pacific is a strategically vital and complex region. There are multiple potential flashpoints, many unresolved territorial disputes, and a mixture of rising and established powers. Any one of these reasons would be a cause for hedging, but with all three, it makes it especially important to get the strategy right. The opportunity for a strategic misstep is huge. To Australia's west, the Indian Ocean is increasingly home to maritime competition and power projection. Nonetheless, the same consideration of maintaining a liberal security order that Professor Zhu mentioned is safe for international trade applies here. And at either end of the Indian Ocean, the strategically critical choke points of the Straits of Hormuz and Malacca. Australia's location at the nexus of the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions make it an increasingly attractive home as a host for American forces, as does its distance from Chinese anti-access capabilities. America's military preeminence once made it the de facto guarantor of at least air and maritime security in Asia. Land operations have always been much harder to dominate and will continue to be so. Australia and America's other Asian allies could enjoy the benefits that followed without investing heavily in the capabilities required to support this security. This is no longer the case given the global financial crisis and the economic circumstances that are now faced globally. A more collective approach to security is likely to be the order of the day. In this environment, the ability of the military of the United States and its allies to work together becomes increasingly important. Australia relies heavily on the United States for so much of the technical military edge that it has in the region. While not everything in the Defence Force has come from the US, many of the smart systems that we have in service have US roots. We've seen a number of major acquisitions from European suppliers, such as the MRH-90 multi-role helicopter, the Tiger armed reconnaissance helicopter, the MRTT air-to-air refuelling aircraft, the MU-90 lightweight torpedo, and the soon-to-be-introduced 2 Spanish-designed ships. The air warfare destroyer and the landing helicopter docks, although Spanish in design, come equipped with American sensors, combat systems, and weapon systems. On balance, the systems sourced from Europe in the past decade have generally proven to be problematic. Both helicopter programs and the MRTT have all had protracted certification processes, and some of these problems are still unresolved. And the MU-90 torpedo acquisition was long and difficult and reduced significantly in scope. The introduction into service of the 2 Spanish-designed ships will happen in the next 2 to 5 years, and fingers crossed that it will be smooth sailing in every sense. As well, European nations often have different configurations in communications and other systems, meaning that additional work has to be done to configure them for Australian use in any case. In contrast, the systems purchased from established American production lines, particularly the Super Hornets and the C-17 Globemaster airlifters on the Air Force side of the house, have been remarkably smooth acquisitions, both coming in on time, on schedule, and even under budget, with minimal reworking required. For balance, however, I will note that developmental systems from American suppliers have been much less smooth. The Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, is now both delayed and over budget as far as we know, and has seen a significant replanning of its in-service timetable. And it's also true that Australia can't always source the equipment that it wants or needs from America. Sometimes the timing isn't right, such as a tanker program where a viable alternative was not available, or Australia is not able to access the complete suite of intellectual property and technical data that it would like to. There's a tension inherent in a sole country as a supplier model. As a buyer, there's a natural interest in greater levels of competition in the marketplace to drive down costs and procure the best possible outcome for both defence and the Australian taxpayer. Competition would be diminished if American companies had the inside running for reasons of interoperability. And, at least in principle, there should be the ability to acquire NATO standard systems and thus achieving interoperability that way. Interoperability does not have to mean having the same stuff and running the same equipment all the time, but it does mean that common standards are a must. But by far the most important role that the Alliance plays in the Australian landscape is that of intelligence sharing. Australia has a long-established relationship in intelligence cooperation through the Five Eyes relationship that encompasses the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This is where interoperability is effectively seamless and the information exchange is deep and routine. The result of that cooperation is a very effective burden-sharing arrangement, with the various partners taking primary responsibility for their part of the world. This results in a global capability where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. All of these elements mean that Australia has access to a larger partner with unique capabilities that we are comfortable working with in all parts of the security spectrum. The alliance does not mean that Australia blindly follows what the US is doing. It's a much more complicated relationship. There is, for want of a better turn of phrase, like and love at play. For example, I love my son. I don't really like him when he draws on the walls. I didn't really like the global financial crisis and the role that America played in it, but I do respect the way that they have re-regulated their banking system to make it much harder for this ever to happen again. The system wasn't perfect, but it strives to be nonetheless. Is the US alliance Australia's best defence? I would say yes, but it's not Australia's only defence. There are a raft of bilateral and multilateral agreements that Australia has in the region with her Asia-Pacific neighbours on matters of both security and defence. Australia is not preparing for any particular threat to its trade, sovereignty or way of life, but it helps to have a few different friends and partners throughout the globe should the future not be as rosy as we all hope. The US is an integral part of our defensive insurance policy. Thank you.
Jim Molan is a retired Major General in the Australian Army and was named Australian Thinker of the Year in 2009. He commanded multinational forces of 300,000 troops in Iraq and has served all over the world. He was awarded the Legion of Merit by the United States Government and the Distinguished Service Cross by the Australian Government. Please welcome him.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know the topic. Is the US alliance, that's alliance with a capital A, it's not a partnership, it's not friendliness, it's a formal alliance. Is the US alliance our best defence? Those opposite have tried to demonstrate that the benefits to Australia or to any other nation that Australia or any other nation receives from the US alliance is greater than going it alone. I think that so far they haven't established that. What needs to be pointed out fairly early is that if a nation elects not to remain or not to become part of a US alliance, they can still be friends with, they can still trade with, or they can even go to war with the US. Nor does it mean that the current level of totally inadequate defence self-reliance that a country like Australia provides itself with because it is in alliance with the US, would be at the same dangerous level if it elected out of the alliance. So along these lines, I ask you, what has the US done for the world apart from freedom, prosperity, the defeat of fascism and the defeat of certain forms of communism? According to the ambassador, it seems to have a lot to do with resources and with cyberspace. But when I look back over the last 50 years, and this is possibly an incomplete list, I see that US military activities have involved conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Cuba, Grenada, Haiti, the Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Somalia, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. And of course, a resounding victory in the Cold War. The US has been busy and Australia has played a supporting role in some of these. We called it containing communism, restoring democracy, spreading freedom and the American way of life, humanitarian intervention even, playing international policemen, waging war on terrorism. Most of it, I must admit, was probably justified and some was even successful. I can't think of too many times in which Australia said no. But I oppose this topic. I don't think that the US alliance is the best defence for countries like Australia. The simple reason is that many in alliance with the US don't use the US alliance for their defence. Instead, their alliance is used as an excuse for avoiding responsible national investment in each individual nation's defence. As such, the US alliance is not good for our defence, it's corrosive. A little while ago, I saw a comment in particular from then Secretary of Defence Gates that the biggest US alliance, NATO, has become a two-tiered alliance, meaning the US does the heavy lifting, everyone else shows deep commitment by doing as little as possible, vowing with public resolve to fight to the last US soldier. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. It's always been like this. Katharine Hepburn once said of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, "She gave him sex, he gave her class." And this is exactly the same for NATO and ANZUS. The Americans provide the clout, the Europeans give them political cover, and we give them a place for US Marines to train, which looks like a base to me, for the US Air Force to practice bombing, to anchor the southern end of whatever the US-China strategy is, and we front up to a fair number of wars. But now that we've deluded ourselves that we face a long period of peace, and we think that it's safe to question why we have alliances, we forget the famous words that echo across the great span of human endeavour. Peace is that brief, glorious moment in history when everybody stands around reloading. When things go bad, regardless of a US alliance, will the US want to assist us, or will they be able to assist us? As I've intimated, I'm a friend of the US, and I respect it, and I think that the US, sometimes imperfectly, tries to uphold values that I believe Australia should uphold if we actually gave ourselves the means. I often make the statement that the US military is without doubt the best in the world, and while acknowledging historically low levels of individual failures, the US wages war in a legal and ethical manner, so why not pile on board? The big clue lies in the work of a well-known Australian strategic analyst, Mark Thompson. Thompson recently just came out and said what for decades has been camouflaged by too clever by half strategic verbiage. He said the most logical strategic choice for Australia is to free ride on the US for our defence, but to his credit, he acknowledged its duplicity as a policy. Now, if you're going to free ride on any nation for your defence, then the US might be the best, until, of course, that free ride is tested. Free riding, ladies and gentlemen, is a strategy for war which undoubtedly works best in the absence of conflict. It's designed for extreme situations, but may not work in a serious war. Over time, we Australians have had various big and powerful friends that we've used as a strategic security blanket. At the end of our colonial period of dependency, Robert Menzies epitomised our reverent view of the mother country when he said of the Queen, "I did but see her passing by, and yet I loved her till I die." Harold Holt went all the way with LBJ. John Gorton observed this phenomenon when he said, "Our PMs go to Washington and lie on their back like puppies, asking for their tummies to be tickled." And perhaps Mark Latham put it best, and we all know this, when he described what our leadership does as the arse-licking visit of Howard to the US, resulting in a conga line of suckholes. But, ladies and gentlemen, by appointing Bob Carr, the Gillard government edged ahead, I think, even of the Hawke government as the most pro-American Labor administration since war drove John Curtin to turn to Washington, as he said, without any inhibitions, free of any pangs. That was, of course, in the face of strategic disaster following the most significant time in our history until now, when Australia refused for decades to defend itself. Now, free riding on the US is a defence strategy that a large proportion of the world subscribes to, So why should Australia not stick with it as a national defence strategy? In Australia, think of all the pink bats and school halls and offshore processing facilities we can build if we just keep running down the defence vote. And governments will say the US will always be there to defend us because we are important to the US, and they always say such nice things about us and about our soldiers. So the biggest danger in believing that the US alliance is our best defence lies not with the US itself. It does not lie in the somewhat vague fear of an emerging power such as China, or in the impact that extreme instability in the Middle East might have on our prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, it lies with us. By saying that the US alliance is our best defence, we allow ourselves to not take our defence seriously. The US alliance is not our best defence. We are our best defence. If Australia continues to underfund its own defence, but covers up the strategic risk by saying or implying that the US will always be there, we are making policy from a strategy-free vantage point. We're lying to ourselves. Remember, we tried this dumb approach with another great and powerful friend in the 1930s, and they dumped on us in 1941 and 1942. So let's not be so stupid again as we face a period of strategic uncertainty unprecedented since at least the early 70s and probably since World War II. Australia's best defence will always be based on sovereign Australian power, which would take no more than a sustained spend of 2% of our GDP, would give us the ability to act unilaterally when we need to, and to contribute to like-minded alliances when it's in our interests. Imagine being able to say to our good friends the US, when they invite us to the next war, that we will consider it from our strategic interests and not because we need to curry favour. Ladies and gentlemen, the US alliance is not our best defence.
Well, we've heard from our speakers. It's now your turn in the audience, and I'll be inviting you to go to the microphones, and there are 4 of them, one here, one up there in the corner, one there. If you've got a question, a comment, you might want to make a speech for up to a minute, and you'll get the bell too, then feel free to do so. But before we do that, we just need to take a moment to get the results. Thank you. The result of the polling that was undertaken as you entered the hall just before the debate. And this will give us a point of comparison. So, you'll be polled after the debate. You'll have the formal vote to do, and the winner will be announced. But just see how we are at the starting point. Okay, so, really evenly divided. So, the motion before the House is that the US alliance is our best defence. And before the debate took place, the vote was as followed. Against the motion, 30%. For the motion, 36%. And a whopping 30% is undecided. So everything, ladies and gentlemen, is here to win for, and speaking in the audience, you might even be able to turn the result. So we'll start off with microphone number 1. Your name, please, sir.
Richard Gnoski, University of Sydney. A couple of questions to Ambassador Bleich. Why is it that you say we're not being threatened by any kind of power, and you're here to help us with asymmetrical warfare, terrorism, piracy, cyber challenge and intelligence, and yet the Pentagon has a plan, and even now it seems to me that they have a war plan to contain China. Why is it that we have all the heavy lifting equipment that you do in Australia, and we continue to persist with war games that have nothing to do with the sort of things you're mentioning? And a quick one to Catherine Ziesing. Why is it that you say Australia's getting all this equipment from the United States without looking at the fact that other countries in our region are getting the same sort of equipment from the United States? Can you tell us categorically that there's an embargo against the sort of sophisticated equipment we get from the United States, which doesn't apply to aircraft or artillery or anything else to any of the ASEAN countries or some of the other countries in the region. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you not to answer yet. Just make a note, because I'm going to get a few things together and then we'll come back. So I want to gather a few voices from the floor. So microphone 2, your name please?
Yes, Nick Beams from the World Socialist website. Ambassador Blake, I draw your attention to the fact that during Kevin Rudd's first term as Prime Minister, President Obama twice cancelled visits to Australia, only making a visit after Rudd had been removed. It is now known at that time that the United States was hostile to Rudd's concept of an Asia-Pacific community in which the United States would have to make some accommodation to China's aspirations for greater influence in the region in order to try to head off a situation analogous to that which developed between Britain and Germany prior to World War I. And Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, both of whom, of course, you know, refer to the China-US situation in that context. Following Rudd's removal by Labor factional bosses, some of whom were described in official cables made available by WikiLeaks as protected sources of the US Embassy, Obama then did come to Australia. He took the unprecedented decision to unveil a major shift in US foreign policy, the pivot to Asia, not from the Rose Garden at the White House or in an address to the US Congress, but in a speech delivered from the floor of the Australian Parliament.
Okay.
It's very clear that the pivot is
That's
directed...
your time. That's your time up.
Just let me finish.
Well, no, you get a minute.
Is directed against China, and given the proclivity for, and endangers the population of Australia and the world with war, given the proclivity of the US...
Well done, thank you. Yeah.
That the US Embassy had nothing to do...
Okay, you've had your minute. It's an important thing about this House, and I'm going to let you respond immediately to that, is that the audience is rather intolerant of people who take more than their time, whether they're here or there. Ambassador Blight, you might want to respond to that part of the question.
Well, can I respond to both
yeah,
Rich's
okay,
question?
Yeah.
So Rich, first on the issue of the Pentagon's got a plan to contain China. We don't. And I don't know where you're getting your information from, but that's not America's approach. And if you just look at what we're doing in the region, it's not about that at all. Secondly, if you want to look at the what you described as war games that we do in the region, I'd ask you to look at precisely what the most recent exercise was here. Our exercises involved things like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It had to do with breaking up a strife in a particular region where you have a scarcity, shortage, and people are raiding to try and get those resources. Precisely the sorts of things that I was describing. And working together to make sure that our cyber security systems are secure and that we can communicate with each other, notwithstanding hacking attempts or attempts to exploit weaknesses in cyber. So it's precisely the sort of things that I said we were doing, and if you just look at what we actually do in the world as opposed to what people like to suspect we're doing, what you'd find is that we're actually being entirely true to our word. Now, with respect to the statement that the President of the United States cleverly arranged for the Senate to hold off to the very last minute any vote on health care so that he wouldn't be able to come out here and visit with Prime Minister
That's real
Rudd.
power, isn't it?
Yeah, and then later on, he brilliantly ensured that you would have the Deepwater Horizon oil spill with the images of oil coming up every single day so that he wouldn't have to fly here to visit with Prime Minister Rudd. You know, it's not true. The president was anxious to get out here. It was one of the first visits that he scheduled. He had 2 reasons why he couldn't come out. That came up at the last minute. Literally, I got the call the night that he was supposed to be flying out, saying, I just can't leave because of the Deepwater Horizon spill. In terms of during his first term, Prime Minister Rudd's agenda on the Asia-Pacific community, we supported that. We thought it was a great idea, and we have supported the East Asia Summit. We have joined we signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation for ASEAN. We have gotten involved in the East Asia Summit so that all the parties in the region would be in one organization together and we could work through any dispute, whether it was an economic one or a security dispute, together. So that's the, that is the truth. Those are the facts.
Okay, Catherine, can you give a guarantee that the US is not providing hardware of equal quality to other countries in the region, and that Australia is getting special access? That was, I think, the central part of the question.
Yeah, the question from Mr. Richard Branowski. They may get the same equipment, but they do not get the same training. They may get the same equipment, but they may not get the same threat library. I'm pretty sure that if I bought an F1 car, I could drive it. I would have a much better chance of winning a race if I had Michael Schumacher to give me some training on it. If I knew how to work it properly, if I knew how to operate it properly, and I knew the full capability that I was buying, I would get more out of it. So yes, the US does sell the same equipment to our regional partners, but do they give all the bells and whistles to our regional partners? I don't think they do.
Okay, thank you. Microphone 3, your name please.
My name is Sam Murray. I'm a student at the University of Sydney, and my question is for the Major General. I understood and think the argument regarding free riding is compelling, that if against the conventional military threat of, say, invasion, that the United States might not come to our defense. So my question is threefold. Firstly, do we actually face any conventional military threats like Imperial Japan in the 1930s? If we do, who are they from? And does the free riding argument actually work against the asymmetrical threats that Australia faces in the modern world, like with respect to failed states, terrorism, international crime networks, maritime security? So with respect to everything that Catherine told us about what the United States is doing for us in combating those threats, can we objectively rely on the United States, considering how much help they've been to us with respect to actual realistic threats in the modern day? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
No, hold off, because we're going to get a couple more. So you can hold this, you're a general, you're holding the microphone 2.
Good evening, my name's Peter Grulemans. I'm a member of the Support Assange and WikiLeaks coalition. Ambassador Blyche said that no two nations are better at combating corruption than Australia and America. How can that be true when we look at the war that was waged in Iraq on false pretenses, which roots back to the 9/11 catastrophe? And if Australians and Americans were to dare to question the authenticity of the reports of what happened in 9/11, we would be silenced or ridiculed. How can you say that the American government is not corrupt if it has waged this war? And most Americans I meet, I went on a cruise last year and I asked them, have you heard about the third building that collapsed at 9/11? And most of them haven't heard about it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to I'll jump the order because I think you should be given a right immediately to respond to that. So then we'll come back to you, Jim.
Yeah, no, first, I don't think that releases of classified information are good at eliminating corruption. In fact, they do just the opposite. So let me give you an example. Muammar Gaddafi. Well, you said the U.S. is corrupt, and so Muammar Gaddafi was clearly a corrupt leader and was doing terrible things to his own people. We were working on that. Because of WikiLeaks releases, that information was made public. We lost our ambassador there. We lost a number of other key insights, and we weren't able to have our full strength at the time that Libya started to fall. This is not something that helps you address corruption. It's something that limits your ability to address corruption, to share that sort of information. With respect to the question about the facts relating to 9/11 and whether or not the U.S. has somehow suppressed that information, the U.S. had a broad commission which did an in-depth investigation. It was shared in by people from numerous nations. We have published fully the 9/11 report. We also have the eyewitness accounts of thousands of people, and so the notion that somehow the U.S. has managed to cover this up is along the lines of saying that the U.S. has somehow faked the moon landing and some of these other conspiracy theories, which over the years have always been discredited.
Can I just suggest, in terms of your questions and comments, really the debate was not to put the US on trial tonight for every imperfection. It's around the topic. is the alliance the best defence? And we'll come to that. Jim Molan, the question from the gentleman from Sydney Uni was asking you, well, what are these threats and why not free ride given the particular character?
Simon, thank you. Sam, I spoke about the free ride, and the analyst who spoke about it when he was talking about the free ride essentially was saying that we can afford to spend less on our defence because the US is spending more. Therefore, we don't have to have a balanced defence force. We don't have to have a defence force which works within itself, because that becomes expensive. We can continue to send our Air Force to work with the American Air Force and our ground forces to work under the American ground forces, etc., etc. So that's, I think, what free ride means. It doesn't apply necessarily to conventional or to non-conventional threats to Australia. I don't think that in the foreseeable future we face invasion. I know a lot of people talk about it, but I think that at the moment it would take many, many years for any country to have the ability to invade Australia, and it would be quite out of context to do it. Therefore, who is likely to do it, I think, is irrelevant, and being asymmetric or non-asymmetric, I think, is also irrelevant. What is irrelevant is that none of us can predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen. Therefore, you've got to make a judgment as to what your Defence Force can do in the first instance. In a lot of ways, that's decided by what you can afford, and then you get into contingency planning. I just don't think that the basis of a good relationship and a good friendship is based on free riding.
Jim, can I ask you, if we were having this debate in Japan tonight, would the US alliance be their best defence? Because I'm amazed in some senses that we had this very benign world being pictured. I think if we'd been in Manila or if we'd been in Tokyo tonight, they'd be talking about China, for example, and say, actually, this is pretty serious for us, the way they're talking. So would it make more sense for the Japanese?
That's a very good point. And I'd suggest to you that the Japanese, although they spend a relatively small amount of their GDP on defence, have produced a defence force, the parts of which that are relevant to the strategic environment in which they work, essentially their Air Force, anti-ballistic missile defence, and their Navy, is pretty good. I'd suggest to you that they aren't free riding, therefore they can go into an alliance.
And I'll come to you about this in a moment, Professor Zhu, but Catherine, you seem to suggest, you did mention a bit of maritime insecurity at risk in the Indian Ocean, but I got the sense that you don't think that the situation in the South China Sea is particularly troubling. Is that right?
It is troubling to some extent, in that the plan that China has put forward in where it would like to exercise its sovereignty, the first, second and third island chains where they would like to be able to exercise their power freely. I don't think Japan is terribly impressed because they are in the second island chain and they consider themselves a sovereign nation, and so they should. How China manages their power projection into that region is a huge issue for Japan. They have balanced their force according to their geographic and political circumstances. Australia has done the same. In many respects, we're very lucky. Our geography protects us from many of the issues that are arising in our region at the moment. Japan does not have that luxury. And Jim, you spoke of a balanced force for Australia. What does a balanced force look like for us?
If I can, Kath asked me a question. A balanced force looks very much like the force that was agreed by Kevin Rudd in 2009 but not funded by Kevin Rudd in 2009. It looks very much like the force that was called Force 2030, and we're kind of sticking with a Force 2030 force structure, but we're not funding it. Therefore, we are not balanced in any way, shape or form. And I can't look into the future and see when we will have a balanced force.
And just before I go back to the President, to be clear, are you saying you accept Professor Zhu's assertion that China is not really to be worried about, that it's going to be pretty benign, or do you look at China as one of the potential actors in this area that we should be thinking about seriously as potentially projecting power in a way that could be threatening?
I think China is growing in terms of its economic power is growing, and with that comes its ability to flex its diplomatic and its security powers. As a sovereign nation, it does have that right. But when it comes to putting their views onto another sovereign nation through force, that is what I have issue with. By all means, sort out the territorial disputes as you will, but please leave loss of life out of it.
Oh, well, I'd like to weigh in on that. Our view about China is that it's as it becomes economically stronger, so will its military force. That's natural. That's what happens with every nation. We think that's appropriate. One of the important things is that as nations rise in this region, because China will not be the only country that does that, as nations rise in this region, we have to be working together. We have to be doing exercises together. We have to recognize common threats, and we have to be very transparent about both our intentions and our capabilities with one another. And that's been our message to everyone in the region, including China. And we don't see China's growing military strength as a threat. We see it as an opportunity to address some of the common issues that we all recognize here, the ones that I mentioned earlier. And so when we do our trainings, we're training with not just Australia and Philippines and South Korea and Thailand and Japan, our allies. We train with others as well, because our goal is to be interoperable, to understand each other, to avoid misunderstandings. And we don't see a threat, we see an opportunity.
So you must be feeling pretty comforted now. I mean, all this thing about bases around you and 9 sets of armies and things, do you now look at those and say, well, perhaps they're not quite the problem you thought them to be?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if you look at China's economic prosperity and China's development in the past 30 years, they all just achieved with America's regional security supremacy. So for that point, I really don't think that'll be a big challenge for China. We have to overcome, for example, America's online system. So if the past 30 years is very telling, then we can really not just live in peace with the US, but also getting some sort of accustomed to each other. But the key challenge is whether China is getting bigger. US strategic shift is truly just going more broader. So now the pivoting Asia policy, yes, is turning on China and hardening some sort of such a military encirclement. I can't agree with Mr. Ambassador more. I think the US policy, even the pivoting Asia policy, is package of policy components. Someone is engaging China, someone is, reinforce the military presence. But for Chinese, it's really, really hard to draw a clear-cut line between containing China or hating China. On the other hand, if you heard a lot of such unfriendly rhetoric and some sort of such an interest group driven, the China factor exploitation, that trend remains very worrisome. So then, yes, from China's perspective, we would like to take the Americans' hand very tightly, boosting Myanmar relations. But on the other hand, how skillful the diplomacy could be from both sides, I think it's really, really untasted factor for their future relations.
Okay, let's get back to the floor. We're going to take 3 speakers in a row. Start off with microphone 1. Your name, please.
Peter Hindrup. We are invited by Mr. Ambassador to judge the US on what it does. Jim gave us a quick rundown of what's been involved in the last 50 years. President Carter says that the US has been involved in over 140 instances of destabilizing or destroying legitimate government. So my question is, nobody has told us where any of these threats are coming from. Everybody's skirting around. But the US is clearly in decline. It's clearly not the power it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So why would we hitch our security on a declining power?
Yeah, well, I might just break, because that is a question we were talking about before. I mean, you're in so much debt. You've got energy self-sufficiency coming. Why would the US be relied on to come when it's needed?
Okay, well, first I'll address the issue of U.S. decline because, we've heard this before. We heard this at the start of the Cold War. The story was that Russia's centralized economy was going to overwhelm the U.S. economy. It could never keep up. And in fact, John F. Kennedy, if you listen to the tape recordings, that was the advice he was getting from his advisors. And that proved not to be the case. And then after the Cold War, everyone said the Cold War's over and Germany and Japan have won and the U.S. has spent its load and it can't keep up. And again, that proved to be wrong. After the global financial crisis, again, the statement was that the U.S., it's in irons, it's a lagging economy, it won't come back. In fact, if you just look at the U.S. economy, 4 years ago, the Dow Jones was at 6,500. Today, it's at over 15,000. If you look at the U.S. economy, every month for the past 36 months, unemployment has been falling and growth has been rising. If you look at any one of the metrics, we have completely reinvented our economy. We've changed our whole energy mix. So now we have the cheapest gas in the world, and it has created over 500,000 new manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and really built up the U.S. economy. And at the same time, we've reduced our carbon footprint more than any other nation in the world. We are one of the most resilient economies in the world. People move when they need to in order to get jobs. Money flows freely around the United States, and capital finds its most productive purpose. And that's why places like Silicon Valley and all of the things that we take for granted in our lives, the Google and the Facebook and the iPads, and those are all coming out of the United States because of the nature of our economy. So I'm not prepared to say that the U.S. is dead or the U.S. is in decline. I think the evidence, once again, is pointing in just the opposite direction.
Okay, we have to be brief, Jeff, because we get some other people in too. Just a very brief final point.
Oh, yes, and then on the other point about running around destabilizing legitimate governments, and that it's 100 and something, that's just not true. And I would defy someone to give me that list, and let me just point about where we've done military actions. Usually they are part of peacekeeping forces. I don't think anyone is saying that we destabilized a legitimate government when we went in to save lives in the former Yugoslavia. I don't think anyone is saying that we were involved in destabilizing a legitimate government when we went into Somalia or when we tried to save lives in Rwanda. When these efforts come up, when innocent people are dying, everyone turns to the United States and says, thank goodness you have the forces that you have to save innocent lives and innocent civilians.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of affirmative action. If you're a woman in the audience and you'd like to contribute to this debate, because I think every speaker so far has been a bloke, I'm going to go to you first, and if you're feeling like you want to jump in, we're going to try a bit of gender balance. So there is a woman up at microphone 4, so you're the next cab off the rank. Yes, please come forward. Your name?
Hi, Kate from UTS. My question is, if we are to be more self-reliant with Australia's security, how well are we utilising the bilingual and multilingual talent within our society? And if we aren't utilising them well, how can we do that better?
Thank you. Microphone 3.
Hi, I'm another student, I'm afraid. My question is to
your
the
name,
Ambassador. You mentioned that the real threats Australia faces today are from criminal organisations and cybersecurity threats. And you also mentioned that the US does a fine job of protecting itself and its allies against such threats. My question is, what evidence is there, not just that they do a good job, but that they would do a better job than, say, China?
Than China?
Or similar allies in the region, because that's the debate.
Okay, so the question there, why wouldn't we back China and its capacity in cyber security and cyber war rather than America? But don't answer yet. Microphone 2.
Yeah, Peter Simmons from the World Socialist website. I'll just make a point first. In the name of defence, governments go to war, and in the case of the United States over the last decade, that's been proven many times. If we're going to put I think we should put the US and the Obama administration on trial. They've been conducting criminal wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, regime change in Libya and Syria. And as far as cyberspace is concerned and cyber operations are concerned, what has been revealed...
Thank you.
What has been revealed...
Sorry, he has a minute, so please let him finish.
what has been revealed by Edward Snowden is the greatest cyber criminal on the face of the planet is the Obama administration. I would just pose one question, and that's in relationship to the build-up which has been taking place throughout the region. By 2020, 60% of US naval forces are going to be in the Pacific. By 2020, 60% of air forces, as well as all the bases that have been alluded to, are going to be in the Pacific.
Question.
This is not about terrorism. This is not about humanitarian operations. This is about
your time is
encircling
finished.
China.
Thank you. And I'll take that as a statement which invites a response in due course. Microphone 4, you've been waiting for a while.
Hi, I'm Tim Jackson, yet another student. So my question's to the entire panel, but in particular the ambassador. The United States military is suffering under the weight of sequestration. At the same time, the United States Congress is unable to pass a budget, in part due to the Republican Congress in particular, which is unwilling to take the necessary steps to ensure national defense. In particular, the popularity and the rise of libertarian members of Congress, including Justin Amash in the House and Rand Paul in the Senate and Ted Cruz again in the Senate, has damaged the United States' capability to ensure national defense. With that said, how is it, that Australia would be able to go it on its own? The United States may not be the best ally, but how is Australia able to go it alone? It seems to me as if what the general is saying is that Australia is like a 6-year-old kid who's getting bullied to take karate lessons. Yeah, sure, you'll be better at fighting, but you're still tiny.
Thank you. Australia's great. Okay, we've got a mixture of things there. We've got how can we take better advantage of our multicultural society? Is America a war criminal? What's happening with the issues around there? Your question about is... Multicultural. Yeah, we've got that. And also, anyway, so let's throw it up. I'm not going to go to you first, Jeff. We'll come to that. Jim, is this ridiculous, training for self-defence, like a 6-year-old being given karate lessons? And try and keep your answers brief if I can ask you to.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name up there at 4, but I think what you say really reflects the chip on the shoulder that Australia suffers from. And when Simon said to the ambassador before, would you really come to our aid? Well, for crying out loud, aren't we the 13th or 14th most richest country in the world? Do you not think that a country of 22 million people with the GDP that we've got, if we had to, could put a shed load more resources into defence? I think by looking at it from our blinkered eyes, I think we set ourselves up for failure. When governments have to provide for defence, they will provide for defence. The problem is that now you've got lots of time and no money. When there is when a threat, if a threat emerges, you'll have as much money as you want, but no time.
Kath?
Sorry, Tim, I loved your comment about a bulked-up 6-year-old. Keep in mind, a 6-year-old can still kick you in the nuts. So we want the ability to strike in a really precision kind of way at our conflicts. So we
might let the analogy finish there.
Yeah, I liked it. I really liked it. We are trying to balance our force so that we have those precision capabilities to strike where it's most needed. So that comes down to cyber, it comes down to special forces, it comes down to space, it comes down to our submarines, the silent service that do so much that we never hear about because of the nature of their classified work. So, we might be 6, but we can still deliver an effect.
And Jeff, I'd ask you to be brief if you can, because I think you've covered a number of the points already in earlier answers.
No, I'll be very brief. I think the question about cybersecurity and why work with the United States points to why the alliance is valuable. The United States shares information. We share information with Australia about how to harden its systems, how to protect things that would make us vulnerable because we are sharing it with others. That's the nature of the U.S. We have always worked with partners. And as I said, today we live in a world where you need more friends and fewer enemies. You need friends who trust you and who share with you. And I don't know if there's any other nation in the world that would share in the way that the U.S. does with Australia. On the issue of sequestration and whether or not the U.S., our security forces are not going anywhere, they are staying here. But I think sequestration and the issues with Australia's budget.
What is sequestration?
Sequestration is in the U.S. Senate. They had an automatic provision that would reduce everyone's budget, including defense. The point is, we all need to do more with less, and the best way to do that is to have able partners who you can share with, which again is why an alliance is so important to Australia, because what it means is that you do get to capitalize and leverage the resources of the United States, that we share information, and we become much more interoperable. It's one thing to have a bunch of planes, it's another thing to have a bunch of planes that work well and integrate well and communicate well with the key allies' planes so that you can respond together. And one pilot can cover both situations.
Thanks. Look, I'm really reluctant to have the debate conclude where we will have had only one woman speak from the floor. So if you're sitting there, briefly, but if you're sitting there as a woman thinking you might like to have a word, this is your moment, because I won't be able to take too many people from the floor, and I've got a question about North Korea for Professor Zhu, but a brief comment from you?
Yeah, I would just like to respond to Kate's question about the role of multilingual skills in the Defence Force. The ADF is trying to diversify the people that it has in terms of women, in terms of racial and religious minorities. They are actively looking for people with language skills. It takes time to train a soldier, though. It is slow but steady work, and it is happening.
Okay. Professor Zhu, you're an expert on North Korea, right? One of the areas. I'm sitting here wondering that with North Korea's regime, with its military arms, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence at the moment that China is actually able to control that situation adequately. Don't we need the United States in our corner in case that all goes terribly bad?
Yep.
Wow. I thought that was kind of a hard question, actually.
I think, let me just briefly respond. I think, first of all, North Korea's issue usually is a big flashpoint, just pulling China and the United States into the war. The war was so bloody, was so cruel. So just a couple of days ago, we witnessed the 60th anniversary of the Korean War. But now I think what just got us always just to have a brief release or relaxing breeze is this. I think Korean War passed 60 years ago, but today, yes, the geographical competition hasn't just fully settled down. But presently, US or China really stand firmly in line against North Korea's nuclear ambition. So then I see it will be a big, the factor to get both sides truly collectively and in a way also win-win address previously very contentious, the security concern. So I'm really looking forward Washington and Beijing could join the hand and get things done. Now, the things has never been more hopeful.
Thank you. Okay, if you've got an yeah, please. With a relatively short amount of time, if you're at the microphone and you have an Y chromosome, your chances are declining. Microphone 3, your name, please.
Hi, my name's Neve O'Connor. I just wanted to raise kind of something that I think that hasn't really been addressed so far. I think a big problem that Australia should consider if it is going to rely on the US for its defence is that the US does not really act outside of its own interests. So if Australia is going to rely on the US for its defence, it needs to think about whether it's happy to turn to the US and possibly be told, okay, this war isn't in our own interest. Like Ambassador, you raised the issue of Somalia and Rwanda earlier, and if you just think about, America's reluctance to intervene in Rwanda after the disaster in Somalia, you can kind of maybe think about what could happen with Australia if something happens here that's not in US interest.
Thank you. So really, don't answer it now. It's a question about surely nations pursue self-interest. So what happens if America's and Australia's interests diverge? Microphone 2.
My name is Donna McIntosh. I think that history should have taught us that great powers will always work in their own best interests, and therefore we can't depend on America or China or anybody working in our best interest. We need to depend on ourselves. I'm with General Molan on this one. We need to think about what our moral issues are, where we want to go, and not make formal alliances with anyone.
Thank you. You're next because you've been waiting longer. I might come to you, but you're going to be really good. Microphone 2.
Hi, I'm a student from Penrith High, and I would like to know, if we as Australia are free riding on America, what is America seeking to gain from our alliance? And a question somebody else wanted to ask is, why are American submarines being allowed to patrol Australia? Or something along the lines of... Why
are there Marines here? Okay, thank you. And now, is this going to be really good?
Hopefully.
Okay, your name. Let's have a crack.
Yeah. So my name's Timothy Simic. I'm Year 11 from school. I was just asking, with what you're proposing, I was wanted to clarify: is it really an alliance, or is it more of a factor of reliance? And how would you define the difference between an alliance and a reliance? And what kind of strategies would you have in place to prevent it from turning into reliance?
Okay, is it alliance or reliance? And how appropriate that the final question from the floor will come from a woman at microphone 2. Your name, please.
My name's Sue Wadley. What I wanted to know is, doesn't a US alliance for Australia mean more friends for the US and more enemies for Australia? Don't America's enemies become our enemies?
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, because of the time, what I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to do is to roll their answers into those series of questions where there's a common theme around alliance versus reliance, the self-interest of nations, and particularly that last question about your enemies becoming our enemies, or the United States enemies. All of those things to be picked up in the final 2-minute summaries that you provide in response. So you're going to have to be really pithy and focused, and I know you're incredibly skillful, so you'll be able to do this. What's going to happen is that in a moment, the panellists will begin this process of summing up for 2 minutes, and what will then happen is that you will be presented with polling boxes. So I hope you remember you've each got a little slip that's behind your shoulder if you haven't already got it. If you are still undecided when it comes to your vote, just leave the for and against slip joined together, but hopefully you've made up your mind and you'll tear it and you'll either put for or against to decide the result. But while you're doing that, these summaries, final points and responses are going to come from each of our 4 speakers. So I'm going to begin by inviting the Ambassador to speak. Remember that the topic for this debate, which you're voting on, think carefully about the topic, it's that the US alliance is our best defence. That's the topic, and that's what's going to be addressed and what you need to vote on. So, now for the final statements. Can I please invite, for 2 minutes, the Ambassador of the United States of America to Australia, Jeff Bleish. If you speak from there, it's fine. Jeff, you can stay there and speak.
Well, first, Simon, thank you, and thank everyone for very provocative, thoughtful questions. The alliance has been a source of stability for this region. When people ask what's in it for the United States, peace and stability is in it for the United States. The United States is a very strong, productive country, and the thing that helps us best is if we have partners around the world with whom we can trade, with whom we can work, with whom we understand. We are a nation of immigrants, and having stable countries from which those immigrants come to renew and refresh the United States on a regular basis has been the source of our strength. That's our self-interest, is to work with others and make them strong and stable too. Now, in terms of our alliance, well, how does that benefit Australia? I think we've made the point, which is that it makes you more capable. It multiplies your influence in the world by virtue of having the strength of the United States by your side where we share values. Now, what I heard from Professor Hugh was that he thinks that the alliance is a good thing, and it's a good thing for Australia. It's a good hedge against a lot of factors. His one concern is that China might overreact to American strength in the region and might make bad decisions. But the way to address that is not by eliminating an alliance that's lasted for over 60 years and that has always, been here throughout the period of the rise. The response is to work more closely together between the U.S. and China, which is precisely what we're doing. What I hear from General Mullen is that, well, it's a good thing, except, if you have this strong a partner by your side, you'll get lazy. That's not going to happen because our two nations, we're democracies. And the U.S. voters aren't going to support our paying all of our hard tax dollars so that others can live off of us and freeload. We have had very honest discussions with our partners around the world, and when you look at the efforts, despite, I think Jim had some great lines in his presentation, that is not what's actually happening. We have capable partners, we work very closely together. And then finally, let me get to this last point, which is that the U.S. only operates in its self-interest and would throw Australia under a bus if there was any divergence in our interests. And it said, look at history. That was the point that struck with me. Look at history. Look at history. I was just up with the Pacific Fleet, and when there was a flood and tsunami and earthquake and then near nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, the people who were there were the Americans. We came in there, we risked our own lives to save the Japanese. When there was a terrible earthquake in Haiti, the very first people on the beach were U.S. Marines, protecting them. We have devoted aid all around the world to support other nations and to support their stability and their peace and their way of life, and to give them an opportunity that they would never have had before. And we have shared our information, we have shared our innovation, we have shared our prosperity, and we have worked in ways that our partners who work most closely with us understand reflects a trust and a genuine affection that has been unknown in human history by any other nation of our size, scale, and power. And so...
But you've just defied my Australian bell.
And so, without further defying the Australian bells, let me just say thank you to Australia for being such good allies, and I hope that we can look forward to another 7 years of the U.S.-Australia alliance and beyond.
Thank you. Professor Zhu Feng, your 2 minutes begins now.
Okay, I think at the end of the day, the debate today also just has never been clearer, because I think there's so many Australian friends keep Mr. Ambassador on the friendly fire and bombarding him with a lot of questions. I think are all evidence about your choice. But anyway, I think the problem is, from the Chinese perspective, as I made my points once again. First of all, we see alliance politics is some sort of anchor of a regional order. U.S., to be honest, whatever we argue with each other, is indispensable power from China. I hope the same logic also could be very powerfully appealing to our American friends. Then, given this, what just always dominates our interest and the calculation? People spread off. Let's have a sustained, economic prosperity. So Chinese-Aussie relations prove that if we can really align, not just diplomatically, but also economically and socially, then our relations has never been stronger and more persistent. So then, the same question we also ask Chinese: what's the best defense for China? Yes, we have one experimental, aircraft carrier. It's a sitting duck. I don't think some sort of aircraft carrier will be answer to the China's security. Most important things, maybe for China's better security, is twofold. One is, to what extent the U.S. will take China as airlines. If the Washington, Beijing could become the airlines, then all the security tension will just vanish overnight. But do you think that's possible? Yes. Some people, just like me, cynically thinking the best defense for China is airline United States. But I have to say, no way. If we do that, then the game, rule of the game completely changed. So then my last point is, whenever we can just hedging against each other, we can just do some things, just serve our goals and keep both sides on vigil. But the basic formula to get the US or China completely indispensable is this. Maybe let's prepare for the worst, but we should always hope for the best. Thanks.
Thank you. To be fair, I should note that you also defied the Australian bell, and the idea of China and US forming a natural alliance might be frightening for all the rest of us. Catherine Ziesing for the motion.
I was particularly taken with the question from Ms McIntosh about what are our own moral issues? What do we hold dear as Australians, as citizens of the world? And I would actually say that most of those issues, such as the rule of law, a democratic government, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of liberty, we hold in common with the US. That is why our alliance is so strong. Do we cross into reliance? I think sometimes we probably do. But then again, we are also able to step back and say, no, we don't want to do that. We don't need to do that. We are happy for you to do that. Go nuts. But it's not Australia's cup of tea because we have an alliance. We don't have a master-slave relationship with the US. It is two stable economies, governments, and democracies coming together in the same interest and hopefully in pursuance of the same goals that we all hold dear, that we all hold true. I don't think that Australia aligning itself with the US attracts more enemies. I think we attract enemies based on our way of life, which in many ways is similar to the US. We hold these same values and ideals dear and true. So these threats will come to us regardless of our alliance or reliance on the US. There are people and causes out there that do not agree with the way that we live our lives, and I don't think that the alliance with the US really has any bearing on that. The US alliance, I think, brings more pros than cons to our lives as Australians and as citizens of the world.
Thank you. And speaking against the motion, Jim Molan.
Thanks, Simon. You may be aware that ambassadors are sent overseas to be polite for their country. And the ambassador was very, very polite to us. It has happened. We are free riding. We have been free riding for a long time and we will free ride into the future. We are spending 1.58% of our GDP and both parties agree that they should be spending 2% of GDP. 2% would get us the force, if you spent it for long enough, would get us the force that would enable us to accept the fact that the US will act in its own interests, but if we ever want to act in our interests, we've got the ability to do it.
Jim, can I just ask you to sit back a bit from the microphone?
Sure, thank you. The US is not evil, but it will operate in its own interests, and it has on occasions, and in relation to Australia, and they've been different from Australia. That people used to say the problem with Africa is that there's not enough US imperialism. Now, it seems to have worked its way out of that situation, but interests are everything. If we want to work in our own interests, we need to give ourselves the ability to do that.
Thank you. Even before we hear the results, and I will get you to applaud them afterwards, can you just join with me in thanking our panel of speakers, Jeff Bleish, Zhu Fung, Catherine Ziesing and Jim Molan. In the next debate, which is on in the 12th of September, we ask if in modern Australia Jack is still as good as his master. And the proposition is that Australia is still the land of the fair go. And you've got an incredible group of speakers for that one. Bob Brown, former senator, Larissa Behrendt, Hugh Mackay, Peter Shergold, who used to head up Prime Minister and Cabinet, Amanda Vanstone, and Young Australian of the Year, Akram Azimi. So It's just before when the election was going to be. So kind of all things don't quite work out. But now television's back on. But now, it's now time for us to receive the final poll results. And let me just remind you in this debate that the US alliance is our best defence, what the results were before the debate. So in the pre-debate poll, the results were as follows. Against the motion, 30%, undecided 34%, and for the motion 36%. So really evenly balanced. And now the results. So in the debate that the US alliance is our best defence, undecided has dropped down to only 10%. There's been a huge swing. For the motion has stayed at 36%, but against the motion, and therefore winning the debate with a margin of 54%, I declare the motion has been lost. So, well done. Congratulations. Congratulations to all the speakers for and against. Our thanks to the speakers, to the audience here at the City Recital Hall, Angel Place here in Sydney, for what's been an extremely important debate, not just for Australia but for everybody else, a debate which divides societies here and around the world. My thanks to Intelligence Squared Australia for making it possible, and it's goodbye from me, Simon Longstaff, and from everyone here in Sydney, in Australia. Good night.